Hello everyone, Find Me in LA here. Hope y'all are having a wonderful day so far. This video is going to be a special one for me. As the title states, this is another retrospective where I review a Horror Nights event from the past, and the year that I'll be covering this time is 2014. Why 2014 you may ask? Well, it was actually my first time ever at Halloween Horror Nights. Let me share with you guys some Find Me in LA lore. I have always been into horror movies, even as a young boy. I mean, there was a movie or two that did genuinely scare me, but for the most part, I was never traumatized. But other than that, I was a huge scaredy cat. I think because all these monsters I saw were behind a screen, I never felt unsafe. I always felt entertained, if anything. However, whenever I encountered something that was tangible and came right at me, like scary looking animatronics or people with creepy costumes and shaker cans during Halloween, I would freak the hell out. Heck, I was scared of things like dogs, clowns, loud noises, and even the wind. No joke, gusty winds would give me total meltdowns. Whenever I went on a field trip in elementary school, my fight or flight would instantly activate because exploring new places always made me anxious. That's how much of a nervous kid I was. The year is 2007, and I see this commercial on TV. A man enters a small fortune teller booth in some sort of carnival. A shadowy figure pulls out 3 tarot cards in front of the man. On the cards were the faces of horror icons Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and Leatherface, all characters that I grew up with. The shadowy figure reveals himself to be Jack the Clown. Finally, the commercial ends with Jason, Freddy, and Leatherface all coming to kill the man, as it cuts to a title: Halloween Horror Nights at Universal Studios. I had no idea what exactly that commercial advertised at the time, but it definitely had my curiosity since I love both Universal Studios and the characters they showcased. I later found out that it was a haunt event that featured scary maze attractions and characters that walk around the park scaring guests, with some of them even wielding actual chainsaws. And for a while, I made it my personal mission to avoid that place at all costs. I was well aware that I was a scaredy cat, and I legit thought that if I somehow got dragged into the park during Horror Nights, the first scare actor to even look in my direction would give me a heart attack. My mom started going and tried to convince me for a while to go with her one day, but my younger self vowed that I, Find Me in LA, would never in a million years go to HHN. Part of the reason why I actually wanted to finally attend the event was because, admittedly, I was always morbidly curious about the actual experience. I would always say that I'd never go, but every time my mom came back from Horror Nights, she would always talk about how much fun she had, and even show me the paper map containing all the attractions and where they were located. Sometimes I would watch the POV videos on YouTube to see what the mazes were like, but my mom always warned me that the videos don't do them justice. The sound effects are ear-piercingly loud. They pump out nasty, cryptic stenches in the air, and the monsters get as close to you as they possibly can without touching you. And all that was what prevented me from going for so long. It just seemed too overwhelming for my liking. But there is another reason that made me finally say yes to HHN, and that was the maze lineup. The main headlining IP of 2014 was The Walking Dead. They had a maze, scare zone, and Tram themed to the hit AMC show. I know the series nowadays is kind of a laughingstock, but back in 2014, it dominated pop culture. Before stuff like Stranger Things was around, we had The Walking Dead. So naturally, I was looking forward to seeing what Universal Studios had in store. There was also Alien vs. Predator. I always found these franchises to be really cool, so I was very excited for this one. Then there was From Dusk Till Dawn. I loved the movie, but the maze was actually based on the TV show, which I never watched, so that did kind of tank my excitement for that one. Dracula Untold was another vampire-themed maze based on the movie with Luke Evans that was released during the middle of October of 2014. So this was one of those promotional mazes, or what Universal calls them, living movie trailers. Wasn't really hyped for this one. Next, there was Face Off in the Flesh. This one actually was excited for because I loved the Face Off show on Sci-Fi. then, there was an American Werewolf in London, which I think was the one I was most hyped for that year. I've always loved classic 80s horror movies, and I was mostly looking forward to seeing all the special effects and all the werewolf animatronics in person. And finally, there was Clowns 3D, Music by Slash, which was another maze I was really curious to check out because it was an original concept. For the first time since I saw that commercial back in 2007, I was genuinely looking forward to Halloween Horror Nights. Fast forward to late September, and I'm at the front gates of Universal Studios Hollywood, getting ready for Halloween Horror Nights. I went with a few of my family members, and we arrived at around 5 o'clock to do early entry, back when it was free, before the dark times. Anyways, people who did early entry had to enter through a secret gate that normally isn't open during the daytime. It's like at the right at the front gate. It led us straight to the front of Waterworld. This area is where everyone received access to the park and where my family and I received our express passes, which back in the day were simply just called front of the line tickets. I got a physical pass with the lanyard, granting us one-time Gate A access per attraction. After we did some crowd shuffling in the upper lot, we headed straight to the mazes that opened up first, which were Walking Dead, AVP, and From Dusk Till Dawn, all located in the back lot. So we walked all the way from the entrance of Waterworld to the Metro sets, which was quite a long walk as you can imagine. I thought it was pretty cool to walk through the backstage areas of Universal Studios for the first time. It was interesting going behind the Mummy ride while on my way to the backlot mazes. There wasn't a scare zone inside of the tunnel back then, but they did have a sign on top of the tunnel saying, "Go to Terminus." I was right next to the King Kong attraction where I saw strobing lights and a plethora of fog coming from the Metro sets. That is when I thought to myself, oh snap, this is it. I entered my first scare zone, which is themed to The Walking Dead. I remember the first thing we saw when we walked in was a weird Terminus lady with a horrible looking wig saying hello to us next to her grill filled with human meat. The walkers were having fun, just doing their thing, growling and snarling at the guests. The scare zone itself wasn't anything spectacular, but the energy from the scare actors was enough to give me a great first impression. And side note, it was really cool to walk through the Metro sets for the first time, which at the time I only saw behind the doors of the studio tour tram. Our first maze of the night had like a 15-minute wait when we went, but we still used our front of the line passes. I don't know why no one in my group thought to save them during early entry and then use the express to do some mazes a second time, but I digress. We finally step into the very first Horror Nights maze I've ever set foot on. AVP, Alien vs Predator. AVP was located in a soundstage, and I gotta say, they really made good use of all that space. Technically, they didn't make a facade in the main entrance, but there is a facade that leads directly to the first scene, which is the crashed Predator spaceship. In the spaceship, you see jars of facehuggers on one side of the room, and on the other are those same jars but empty and broken. And that right there is one of my favorite aspects of Alien vs Predator, the visual storytelling. There wasn't any narration or any character hanging out on the facade explaining the backstory. Just from walking through the first scene or two, we already know that predators crash landed on Earth and that facehuggers have broken out looking for their next hosts. Simple yet brilliant storytelling on display here. Another strong suit of this maze was the masks and puppets. I specifically remembered the group in front of us pushing those curtains that lead to the next room, and in between those curtains I caught a glimpse of the Predator mask and it looked so cool and super detailed. Fun fact, Amalgamated Dynamics Incorporated, the crew behind the Alien vs Predator movies, actually let the makeup group for Horror Nights borrow their molds of the Predators and Xenomorph masks, just so the costumes can look as movie accurate as possible. I also like how there weren't just aliens and predators scaring people. There were a couple of facehugger scares which were done in a clever way. There was also a few human victim scares. Those really gave me the impression that while the aliens and predators were fighting, humans were caught in the crossfire. And speaking of which, I loved how there was a room or two where there was a predator on one side and an alien on the other. It made you feel like you were quite literally in the middle of their battles. It made for some really intense encounters with the creatures. And finally, I have to talk about the grand finale of this maze, the Queen Alien. That scene is straight up a crowning achievement from the creative team. That puppet was so impressive, and I believe this is still the biggest creature made for a Horror Nights maze in Hollywood. So overall, I really enjoyed Alien vs Predator. After walking through it, I knew it was going to be an all-timer for me, and I still think it holds up. Incredible creature effects, great storytelling, and just an overall blast. Our next maze was The Walking Dead, end of the line. The facade was pretty cool. It was basically the prison with the tank crashed into it, and I gotta say, this one did set up a more intense and visceral tone than Alien vs Predator. They had the iconic theme song playing, and there were even a couple of walkers hanging around scaring people before we even went inside. We finally do go inside, and I don't know if it was because we walked through it too quickly or because AVP spoiled me, but Walking Dead didn't really do a whole lot for me. Don't get me wrong, I did have a couple of really good scares and some of the sets were kinda cool, but other than that, there's not much else I can say about this one. This was based on season 4 of the show, and I think for me, they picked some of the most random scenes from that season. I also do think that the lack of any of the main characters really had something to do with my lukewarm experience. There was no Rick, no Michonne, no Glenn, no Maggie, no Daryl, no Beth, no Carol, no Coral, no anybody. It's like making a Last of Us maze without Joel or Ellie, or a Stranger Things house without Eleven. I don't think this was a terrible maze, I thought it was decent enough, but for being the main attraction of Horror Nights that year, I think Walking Dead could have been a lot more exciting, at least for me personally. Next up was From Dusk Till Dawn. Right before we got our passes scanned, we ran into the Gecko brothers. Nowadays, characters outside of facades already have pre-recorded audio to lip sync to, but back then, scare actors were allowed to improvise and ad-lib while interacting with guests. So the brothers and the MC character were outside actually talking and interacting with guests, which I thought was really cool. The facade itself was pretty cool, even though Universal Studios were a bunch of cowards for not giving it the correct name. But anyways, look, again, this was based on the reboot on TV, so I was walking into this one hoping it wasn't too different from the movie, and that actually was the case, only in the first room, with Santanico Pandemonium. The scene is followed with another scene with a bathtub, and then it was at that point where the maze already lost me. There was also a scene with a dining table, and then another scene with what looks like a sacrifice happening, and I was like, what is going on? It was like the opposite of AVP, where I understood the story clearly. Here, it was like they cherry-picked random scenes from the show, slapped them on the maze layout, and just called it a day. Again, I didn't watch the show, so obviously I experienced the house without any of the context, but still, they should have made the maze more accessible and easy to follow for those who know nothing about the show. One thing I will say I did like about the maze was the makeup. I remember the vampire prosthetics being really cool looking, but other than that, From Dusk Till Dawn didn't really leave that much of an impression for me. I really don't remember much from it other than the stuff that I already mentioned. Oh, and near the end, I remember it smelling like stinky cheese, which is pretty random. But yeah, From Dusk Till Dawn was only okay. After completing all the mazes in the back lot, we then walked our way back the way we came to do everything in the lower lot. We walked through the tunnel again, but this time, we saw a sign that said, "Still alive? No problem. The night is young." Once we finally arrived at the lower lot, we came across a scare zone that wasn't around earlier in the night. It was called Skulls, and it had like 4 or 5 stilt walkers that were dressed up as these Wendigo type creatures. Our next maze, which is actually located right next to Jurassic Park, was an American Werewolf in London. Again, since this was my first year, I was still a big scaredy cat and I had my guard all the way up for the first few mazes. But by the time we arrived at American Werewolf, I started to get a bit more comfortable, and part of that was because this was the maze I was most excited to experience. We approached the facade, and I think the audio was what was making me giddy. The combination of the music, the snippets of dialogue from the movie, and the distant sound of a haunting howl of a monstrous wolf. I was ready, and I was not disappointed after walking out. There were a couple of scares that I missed, and at the time I didn't understand what happened, but knowing what I know now, I think I was in the middle of a cast change. For example, in the hospital scene, Nightmare David had a designated trigger scare, but when I went, he was walking around the room scaring everybody individually, right before walking into a random boo hole. Also, they had a scene with all the demon Nazis shooting up a whole room, but I didn't see any of them when I went through. After that, everything was a-okay. They translated all the important scenes from the film very well, and I liked how for the iconic transformation scene, they showed the different stages of the transformation. Albeit the transitions between the stages were kinda awkward, which by the way is my one little nitpick that I do have with this maze. this is where the infamous black walls slowly started to make their way into HHN. Half the time, it seemed like they didn't know how to transition from one scene to the next, but it was nowhere near as bad as some of the black walls and the mazes that came after this one. But other than that, the maze works on so many levels. The scares, the costumes, the makeup, the sound design, the way it perfectly adapts the movie, and of course, the awesome werewolf animatronics. Not only did they look so much like the wolves in the movie, but they would get really close to you, making for some of the most intense moments anyone could ever have in a Horror Nights maze. As an American Werewolf in London enthusiast, I was more than satisfied with this house. Our next maze was Clowns 3D, Music by Slash, which is located in the Mummy venue. This is another one I was looking forward to because it was an original maze. I remember before attending the event, I followed a bunch of HHN fan accounts on Instagram, and they would share updates and reviews on stuff related to Horror Nights, and I remember them posting concept art for this maze that was shared by John Murdy on Twitter. The art looks so cool. It looks so bloody and gory, and the look of the clowns were also pretty gnarly. Apparently Murdy had like these cool deep backstories for each main clown character. All of that made me much more excited for this maze. I was also very curious to check out Slash's music and see how it was gonna enhance the experience. So I put on the 3D glasses, I see the colors pop out of the facade, and I was so ready. Only to walk out from a womp womp kind of experience. First things first, it was not scary at all. Everything was too colorful and bright, so I knew where the scares were. Another thing I took issue with was the way the characters were handled. There were only 3 clown characters, the main one being Sweet Licks, and I believe the other 2 were his children. If I didn't read the backstories given to us by John Murdy, I wouldn't have known a single thing about these characters because the maze doesn't give us anything. Basically, the whole premise is like, oh, these clowns are luring you to their factory promising free ice cream, but spoiler alert, they're cannibal clowns and you're the next main ingredient of their ice cream. I kinda got that from the facade, but other than that, this maze felt like it had no story and it just felt like a generic funhouse. The sick and gory concept art was nothing like the final product, which was ruined by the house's bright colors and overall Fright Fest vibes. There were a couple moments where it was supposed to be silly and darkly comedic, and those moments could have worked if the dark nature of the comedy was a lot darker. So yeah, I ended up not liking this one, but at least my experience was okay. For some odd reason, some of my more core memories during my first year at HHN were in this house. I think it's solely because of the sensory overload and the stimulation I had. I vividly remember walking into that first room and smelling bubblegum in the air while I'm staring at all the 3D colors. I remember seeing bright red blood splatters pop out of a clown's blue costume. There was a scene filled with dummies which were supposedly people puking, and the whole room smelled like vomit. There was also a room which was covered in what I think was supposed to be poop. I remember covering my nose in that area because if the vomit smelled bad, I don't even want to imagine how bad this room smelled. And of course, there was Slash's music overpowering the rest of the maze audio. The music itself was okay, it served its purpose, and I guess it fit the maze well. Overall, Clowns 3D is arguably one of the worst mazes they ever made at HHN, but I guess my anticipation before my experience and all the brain-tickling colors and music make me have a sick certain fondness for this maze. After Clowns, we then headed up to the escalators to go to the upper lot so we could experience the Terror Tram, which was invaded by the Walking Dead. Again, this was my first time experiencing the Terror Tram, so I was very much looking forward to seeing how it was compared to the mazes. I hop on the tram, and I watched this pre-show video, and it was essentially just a reel of scariest walker moments that you'd find on like YouTube or something. Throughout the whole night, I had heard the Walking Dead theme song, followed by a scary announcer guy saying, "AMC's The Walking Dead, only on AMC," so many times that I was low-key starting to get sick of it. We finally stopped in front of the old Who Wheel section, and I saw an assembly line of chainsaw guards. I was like, oh snap, this is gonna be gnarly. The Bates Motel section was really cool, and seeing that area get plagued with walkers was pretty crazy. Also, back in the day, after you left the motel, instead of just going straight to War of the Worlds, you would actually walk up this hill. It was pretty dark and didn't really have any scare actors. There was only like scary forest noises like snakes and people screaming and lions and tigers and bears. It was pretty much a dead zone, and it really ruined the momentum of the Terror Tram experience. But after that, we went inside an indoor mini maze filled with more walkers. we proceeded to walk down this foresty path with even more walkers around us and bloody props displayed everywhere. Then we head into the transition area between the Psycho House and War of the Worlds. I sadly didn't take a picture with Norman Bates. I don't remember why. I think maybe the line was too long, but I don't know. Anyways, we walked through the plane crash site and we see, yup, you guessed it, more walkers. Seeing the huge 747 was really cool, and I think the Walking Dead theme made the most sense thematically in this section. Finally, we went inside another mini maze, and right before we hop back on the tram, we run into more chainsaw guards. And that's the end. When we were on our way back to the park, we saw a trailer for season 5 of the Walking Dead show. So overall, I thought the Terror Tram was pretty cool. However, I think the Walking Dead theme really did hurt the experience in some ways. Seeing a bunch of walkers for so long did kind of drag the attraction, and it made every section feel very samey. Also, as cool as it is to act and scare like a zombie, there's only so much that you can do with a role like that. So yeah, as much as I did enjoy walking through the famous film sets, I did wish there were more than just zombies scaring us. Our next maze was Dracula Untold. Again, I went in late September, and the film it was based on released in the middle of October. So this is like Exorcist Believer, where the maze is basically one big promotion for an upcoming Universal film. After a couple of back-to-back maze experiences where I wasn't feeling all that frightened, and a terror tram that was more interesting than scary, I was slowly starting to get a bit more relaxed. I was thinking to myself, I could easily conquer the remaining 2 mazes with ease. But then I realized, when I was waiting in line for Dracula Untold, and we were next, nobody was in front of us. And as we approached this cave with a small red light that flashed on beat with a heartbeat sound, I thought, holy, what am I in for? The cave portion of the house felt very claustrophobic, making for some intense close scares. If I remember correctly, I think my biggest scare of the night came from this scene. The rest of the maze was pretty hit and miss. Some of the sets were borderline garbage. I remember there was one room where there was an open roof, and right next to us were black walls with flagpoles. Yup, this is real set design here, not like Alien vs Predator. This was peak. It's peak, I tell ya. There was also a scene which I believe was supposed to be a burning village with burn victims running around. I remember the actors doing a pretty good job, but I also remember they had like these TV screens with cheap flame effects. It looked like something you would see in Spirit Halloween. The maze did pick up in the last couple scenes. It had more of those intense scares from the beginning of the house. Dracula Untold was the maze I was least excited for, but after walking out, the maze actually really did surprise me in the scare department. Everything else about it was pretty mid though. Since Dracula was built in the Parisian courtyard, the maze led us straight to the Friend Street scare zone. And by the way, I'm just going to be dedicating these next couple minutes to just me reminiscing about the scare zones in the past. Fun fact, back in 2014, fans of Horror Nights were actually able to choose what scare zone would be at the event. The creative team came up with 3 themes, and fans were given a poll to see which of these ideas would actually come to the event. You know, like which one is your favorite. This is a really cool thing that they did back then. Universal doesn't do anything like that now. But anyways, the scare zone that did get picked and brought to life was called Masquerade. The street was filled with 17th century French aristocrats, and they were in masquerade attire, and they were basically cannibals. Nowadays, scare zone decor is extremely lackluster. The average zone will consist of 1 or 2 dioramas of skeletons or other generic statues dressed up as whatever the theme is, and then they'll add in some dubstep music. But back in the day, they put so much effort into the immersion. In Masquerade, there were stuff like wooden carts and guillotines and a lot of statues all across the street. There were even like tables filled with bloody, torn up corpses, and the music actually fit the time period it was set in. Same thing goes for Dark Christmas. At first, I'm not gonna lie, I initially didn't really care for this one because I thought it was a bit silly to have a Christmas scare zone in an event called Halloween Horror Nights. But looking back at it now, like, we really had it all, man. Not only was the street absolutely covered in fog, and not only were the designs of the characters really cool, but I remember every single corner of that street was decked out. If you looked closely in the windows of the buildings in the area, there were even little Christmas themed knickknacks. This is the attention to detail that scare zones these days are severely lacking. Even the scare zone in the New York area, which was themed to the Purge anarchy, had so much going on visually. There were statues on the ledges of the facades and posters hung up in front of the windows. There were statues in cages and even a whole news van in the middle of the street. And guess what? Not a single one of these zones had an EDM soundtrack. The music actually fit the themes and aesthetics. We used to be a proper country. Now we still have one last maze to talk about, which is Face Off in the Flesh. Like I said, I am a fan of the show on Sci-Fi, so I was very curious to see how it would play out as a haunted attraction. It was located in the old House of Horrors attraction, and fun fact, walking through Face Off was actually my first and only experience with House of Horrors, which is pretty sad because I was incredibly let down with the maze. Literally all they did was shove some of the creatures from the show in the regular House of Horrors, and they added lasers and strobe lights and dubstep to make it different. It was not scary, it was just annoying. I was freaking out a bit, but I don't even think it was because of the scares. I think it was because of the sensory overload. I didn't know what was going on half of the time because I was very disoriented. Also, the music was absolutely garbage, so I wasn't even having fun or getting hyped. There was one point where there was like a DJ and a go-go dancer doing their thing, and I was just not vibing with any of it. I was thinking to myself, like, how is this horror? How is this supposed to be scary? It could not be any more apparent that this maze was made specifically for EDC enthusiasts. The representation of the face-off characters is pretty much non-existent. I didn't even recognize a good third of the characters featured in the maze. I also remember the makeup being not very good, quite bad even. Most, if not all, the monsters were wearing what obviously looked like pullover masks. And it's like, what even is the point of making an attraction based on a show that's all about being precise with the makeup, and the makeup isn't even good? And I totally forgot about this one thing. I swear this just came back to me as I was writing my outline for this video. There was an episode where the artists had to make an original horror villain, and the winner of the challenge gets to have their character featured in the Face-Off maze and the Face-Off scare zone in Orlando. The winner ended up being a character called the Exgirlfriend. Again, she's called Exgirlfriend, okay? Remember that. She had like this big ass shotgun exit wound on her face, and it was a gnarly looking design. And she does make her appearance at the end of the maze, and of course, they did her dirty. She looked awful. But after you finally exit the maze, she comes out to give you one last scare. But she scares you with a chainsaw. The character named Exgirlfriend used a chainsaw. She's not Chainsaw Girlfriend, she's Axe Girlfriend. They couldn't even do that correctly. I got even more mad when I realized I was never gonna do the original House of Horrors because they closed it down after HHN ended. I hate Face Off so much for that. I also hate Face Off for not doing the characters justice with cheap makeup. I hate Face Off for giving a character the wrong weapon of choice. I hate Face Off for appealing to rave fanatics instead of fans of the show. I hate Face Off in the flesh. That maze can go itself. Now that I got that out of the way, let's move on. My group and I walked around the Purge scare zone a bit more. I had a funny interaction with a chainsaw guy with a gas mask. He just got all close to me like he wanted to square up. He didn't even rev his chainsaw, which was odd, but nonetheless, it was pretty funny. After that, we just kind of left the park. It wasn't even 11 o'clock yet, and we just decided to leave for some reason. We didn't do any of the rides, we didn't do any of the mazes a second time, we didn't stay for the chainsaw chase out. I don't know why we left so early. I'm just upset that we had to end the night with Face Off. Oh my god. It's Halloween Horror Nights 2014. Overall, I had an amazing time. I want to take this time to rank the mazes, rate the scare zones, and give my thoughts on the Tram. So, let's start with my quick maze ranking. Number 7, Face Off. Not only is it my least favorite of the year, but it's probably the worst horror attraction that I've ever experienced. It was that offensive to me. Number 6, Clowns 3D. Cheap, generic, and just had so much wasted potential, but I did like some of the colors and the music. Number 5, From Dusk Till Dawn. I honestly think that if it was based on the movie and not the show, this could have been on my top 3 of 2014, but because it was based on the show, it felt boring, it was pretty forgettable, and it wasn't really all that scary. Number 4, Dracula Untold. Half of the set pieces were, again, borderline terrible, but the scares were pretty intense. Number 3, Walking Dead. Really cool energy from the scare actors, a lot of cool set pieces, but I just wish they could have done more. Number 2, Alien vs Predator. The costumes and the puppets were awesome, the sets were hella immersive, and that finale was astounding. The maze just oozed with coolness and fun. And finally, my number one is American Werewolf in London. This is one of the best examples of perfectly adapting a beloved horror film into a haunted attraction. It was apparent that American Werewolf was made with so much care and love and passion, and that's why it's my favorite of this bunch. Now, let's quickly grade the scare zones. Purge Anarchy was decent. I like how it recreated the chaotic energy of the movies. I'm giving it a B+. Dark Christmas. Again, I didn't care for very much at first because I just complained like, oh, like why is there Christmas and Halloween Horror Nights? Like whatever, little bro. So now I look at that zone with so much appreciation because of how immersive it is and how fun it was. And because of that, I'm giving it a solid A. Masquerade was pretty neat. The costumes, decorations, and overall vibe were pretty solid. I'm giving that one a B. And then finally, Walking Dead. It was kind of underwhelming, not gonna lie. Again, for being the main attraction of 2014, they should have done more than just siren lights and shipping containers. But because this was my very first ever scare zone, I'm always gonna have a soft spot for it. So I'm giving it a B-. Last but not least, the Terror Tram. I really wish my first Terror Tram wasn't Walking Dead themed. I think it would have given me a much better first impression if it was based on an original concept or even a different IP that has much more to offer. But overall, I think Terror Tram 2014 gets a solid 6.5 out of 10 for me. Before I wrap this video up, I just want to say this. After my trip to my first Horror Nights, I immediately became hooked. 2015 hit, and I was already looking at rumors and updates online. That's when I found forums dedicated to Horror Nights where I discovered fans who were just as passionate about the event as I was. Then I found HHN updaters on YouTube who would post their speculations and theories and would even film construction updates. Back then, John Murray would actually interact with fans via the official Horror Nights Twitter account and would even give out code names so we could try to figure out what exactly was coming to the event. I was a part of all of that back then. I tried to be so involved with that kind of stuff. I went from being terrified of haunts to being obsessed with them. A complete 180 in just under a year. That's the power of Halloween Horror Nights. And real quick, I want to give a huge shout out to my mom. If she wasn't such a fan of all things scary and would have never convinced me to go to Horror Nights, I wouldn't even be making these videos. Love you lots, mama. I went one time in 2014 and I haven't missed a year since. It has quite literally become an annual tradition for me and my family. And just from these past couple years alone, I have seen more of my family members and even close friends of mine who, just like me, were terrified of haunted houses, and then they finally attended Horror Nights and instantly become fans of the event and already want to come back next year. I just think that's so cool and neat. So, if there's any takeaway you can take from this video, it's this. If you or someone you know have ever thought about coming to Horror Nights but were always too scared to do so, do it. Push yourself out of your comfort zone, because you never know what hyperfixation you might discover or what friends you might make. This just goes for about anything, not just Horror Nights. If you want to do something, just go for it. If not, then you're going to spend the rest of your life wondering how things would have been different for you if you didn't check it out. And this is the note that I'm going to be ending this video on. Sorry for getting all deep and philosophical. Like I said, this is a very important video for me. If you like what you saw, go ahead and click the like button. If you want to see more content like this, go ahead and click the subscribe button. I know this video was lengthier than usual compared to my other videos, so if you stuck around to the very end of it, thank you so much for watching. And until then, see you all in the fog.